The whispers in the fog. The late autumn air hung heavy with a damp chill as Elise zipped up her jacket and adjusted the flashlight in her hand. Evening hikes were her solace, her ritual, a brief reprieve from the monotony of life in Briarwood. The sleepy town offered little in terms of excitement, but the woods on its outskirts, with their twisting paths and towering trees, gave her a sense of adventure, a place to think and breathe. Tonight, however, something felt off. The fog had started rolling in earlier than usual. At first it was a faint haze, clinging low to the ground like an afterthought of the evening air. But as Elise ventured deeper into the woods, the fog thickened into a living, shifting thing. It coiled between the trees, swallowing the underbrush and blurring the edges of the familiar trail she knew so well. She paused, shining her flashlight ahead. Its beam barely penetrated the grey, casting dim, distorted shadows that danced and flickered with each step. Her stomach tightened with unease. The forest had always been a place of comfort for her, but tonight it felt alien, unwelcoming. "Just the weather," she muttered under her breath, trying to shake off the creeping dread. "You've walked this path 100 times. Her words felt hollow, swallowed almost instantly by the oppressive silence. The usual sounds of the forest, rustling leaves, the hoot of an owl, the distant trickle of a stream, were absent. The only sound was the crunch of her boots on the dirt trail, unnervingly loud in the stillness. Elise stopped again, turning to look behind her. The fog was even thicker now, a solid wall of grey that obscured the path she'd just come down. She checked her phone, but as expected, there was no signal. Not here, not this deep into the woods. Frustrated, she shoved it back into her pocket. The unease clawed at her now, no longer a subtle whisper in her mind, but a persistent scream. She turned to head back, hoping her instincts would guide her, even though the trail markers she relied on, the gnarled oak, the chipped birch tree, were lost in the fog. But as she retraced her steps, a sound stopped her in her tracks. It was faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the wind, if there had been any wind. A low, soft murmur, like voices carried on the edge of the fog. Elise's heart quickened as she strained to listen. It was unmistakable now, the sound of whispering. Not one voice, but many, overlapping, tangled and indistinct. The words were impossible to make out, but the tone was unsettling, urgent, insistent. "Hello," Elise called, her voice trembling. She hated how small and afraid she sounded, but the unnatural quiet was suffocating. No response came, only the whispers growing louder, closer. They seemed to move with the fog circling her, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she turned in frantic circles, her flashlight swinging wildly, illuminating nothing but endless grey. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice rising. "This isn't funny." The whispers stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, and for a moment Elise almost wished they would return. She stood frozen, her breath shallow and uneven, her hands gripping the flashlight so tightly that her knuckles ached. Then a single word broke the quiet. Elise. Her name, clear as a bell, spoken in a voice she didn't recognize. It came from ahead, deeper into the fog. Against every instinct screaming at her to turn back, she took a step forward, then another. The pull was impossible to resist, a magnetic force that urged her onward despite the dread pooling in her stomach. The forest seemed to shift around her as she walked, the fog thickening and thinning in unnatural waves. She stumbled over roots that hadn't been there before, passing trees that looked unfamiliar, their twisted shapes like frozen spectres. The whispers began again, softer this time, coaxing, beckoning. "Elise!" She didn't know how long she walked. Time felt meaningless in the endless grey. Just as panic began to overwhelm her, the fog started to lift. Shapes emerged from the murk, street lamps, rooftops, the familiar outline of Briarwood's town hall steeple. Relief washed over her. She was home. She quickened her pace, her legs trembling with exhaustion as the last of the fog dissolved. The streets were eerily quiet, but she chalked it up to the late hour. She must have been in the woods longer than she realised. When she reached her house, the sight of its cheerful blue shutters and flower-filled window boxes brought a lump to her throat. She rushed to the door, fumbling with her keys. Inside, the warm glow of the kitchen light greeted her. and for a moment she felt safe again. "Elise, you're losing it," she muttered, shaking her head as she locked the door behind her. She set the flashlight on the counter and poured herself a glass of water, the cool liquid soothing her parched throat. She had just taken a sip when a knock at the door made her jump. Setting the glass down, she walked to the window and peeked out. A figure stood on the porch, backlit by the porch light. It was her neighbour, Mrs. Grayson, but her expression was strange, wide-eyed, almost fearful. Elise opened the door. "Mrs. Grayson, are you okay?" The old woman stared at her, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Finally she spoke, her voice trembling. "Who are you, and why are you in Elise's house?" Elise's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about? It's me, Elise." Mrs. Grayson's face hardened. "Elise who?" A chill unlike anything Elise had ever felt crept over her. She turned to look inside the house, her house, but suddenly it didn't feel like hers at all. The furniture, the pictures on the walls, the small details she'd collected over years of living there, something was wrong, slightly off, subtly different. The whispers returned, faint and mocking. Elise spun back to the door, but Mrs. Grayson was gone. The street was empty, and then she realised she wasn't home at all. Elise froze, her breath catching in her throat. The whispers weren't faint this time. They were distinct, resonating softly within the walls of her house. Her skin prickled with an unnatural chill as her mind raced. It couldn't be real. It had to be the lingering effects of the fog, the tension of getting lost. She forced herself to take a steadying breath, clinging to rationality. But the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, carrying an unnatural clarity, though the words remained indecipherable. It was as though a crowd had gathered somewhere in her home, murmuring in tones that hovered just out of comprehension. "Hello," Elise called out, her voice trembling as she took a cautious step toward the living room. "Is someone there?" Her own voice felt strange in the space, too loud and out of place. She flipped the light switch, bathing the room in a warm glow. Everything looked the same. Her comfortable sofa, the bookshelf lined with well-worn paperbacks, the small knickknacks she'd collected over the years. And yet, something felt fundamentally wrong, as if the room had shifted in her absence. The whispers continued, persistent and eerie. Elise turned toward the hallway leading to her bedroom, gripping the flashlight she had set on the counter earlier. Her fingers tightened around it as if the weight of the object could anchor her to reality. As she stepped into the hallway, the air grew colder, heavier. The whispers seemed to follow her, trailing just behind, an unsettling chorus that ebbed and flowed like a tide. She paused at her bedroom door, hesitating before pushing it open. The room was dark, the shadows long and distorted in the faint moonlight filtering through the window. Nothing moved. The air was still. But the whispers were louder now, almost unbearable. Elise flipped the switch, but the light didn't come on. She cursed under her breath, stepping back into the hall. Her heart raced as she swung the flashlight toward the stairs leading to the attic. The whispers shifted, as though retreating above her. "This is insane," she muttered, trying to steady her breathing. "There's no one here." Yet she couldn't ignore the pull, the inexplicable need to follow the sound. Her feet moved before her mind could protest, carrying her up the creaking wooden stairs. The attic door loomed at the top, its edges shrouded in shadow. Elise reached for the knob, her hand shaking, and pushed it open. The whispers stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. She hesitated on the threshold, her flashlight beam sweeping across the cluttered attic. Boxes and old furniture cast strange shapes against the walls, but nothing seemed out of place. She stepped inside, the floorboards creaking beneath her weight, and then a voice pierced the silence, clear, distinct, and chillingly familiar. "Elise." She froze, her grip on the flashlight tightening. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "Show yourself!" The voice came again, softer this time, almost gentle. "You don't belong here." The words struck her like a blow. Her breath quickened as her eyes darted around the attic, searching for the source. But there was nothing, only shadows and the faint, acrid smell of dust. Suddenly the flashlight flickered, its beam dimming and then dying completely. Darkness swallowed her, thick and suffocating. Panic surged through her, and she stumbled backward, her foot catching on a loose board. She fell, the air rushing from her lungs as she hit the ground. For a moment she lay there, gasping, her heart pounding in her ears. The darkness pressed in around her and the whispers returned, louder and more menacing. She scrambled to her feet, the sound enveloping her as though the house itself were alive. Elise bolted down the stairs, her mind consumed by a single thought: I need to get out of here. But when she reached the front door and threw it open, her heart sank. The street outside was unrecognizable. The familiar rows of houses were gone, replaced by an endless expanse of grey fog. It swirled and shifted, obscuring everything beyond her porch. No, she whispered, stepping outside. This can't be happening. She turned, her eyes scanning the fog for any sign of life, but there was nothing, no sound, no movement. The whispers followed her, now faint but ever present, a constant reminder that she wasn't alone. As she stepped back inside, the door slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing through the house. She spun around, her chest heaving, but the door was still and silent. She reached for the knob, pulling at it with all her strength, but it wouldn't budge. It was as though the house itself was holding her captive. Elise's mind raced as she backed away from the door, her legs trembling. Her eyes fell on the framed photographs lining the wall. They had always been a source of comfort, snapshots of her life, moments frozen in time. But now they were wrong. She moved closer, her breath catching in her throat. The faces in the photos weren't hers. Her family, her friends, even her childhood self, all replaced by strangers. Their expressions were blank, their eyes staring straight ahead, devoid of emotion. Elise stumbled backward, shaking her head. This isn't real. This can't be real. The whispers grew louder, the words still indecipherable but filled with an unmistakable malice. The house seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing tighter, the air growing colder. And then, through the cacophony of whispers, the voice returned, soft and almost kind. You're not where you think you are. Elise fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face as the truth settled over her like a weight she couldn't lift. She wasn't in her home. She wasn't even sure she was in Briarwood anymore. The fog outside thickened, pressing against the windows like a living thing, and Elise realized with chilling certainty that she wasn't alone, and she never would be again. Elise sat frozen on the hardwood floor of her living room, her body trembling as the oppressive whispers grew louder, more insistent. They wrapped around her like tendrils of fog, choking her thoughts and unravelling her sense of reality. She clutched her knees to her chest, rocking slightly, as the weight of what she had seen and heard pressed down on her. The photographs, the voices, the strange fog, they all pointed to one impossible truth. She was no longer in the world she knew. The room seemed darker now, the corners stretching impossibly far away, as if the house itself were growing, distorting around her. She forced herself to stand, her legs wobbling beneath her. She had to find a way out, to understand what was happening. Even if it was futile, she couldn't just sit and wait for the unknown to consume her. The whispers shifted again, becoming less fragmented, more focused. This time, she could almost make out words, snatches of sentences spoken in a language she didn't understand but somehow felt familiar. She turned toward the hallway leading to the front door, her heartbeat quickening. The fog outside pressed against the windows, glowing faintly, pulsating like a living thing. Gathering her courage, Elise moved to the door and reached for the knob. It wouldn't budge, as if the house itself was keeping her prisoner. She slammed her fists against the wood, screaming, "Let me out!" Her voice echoed back at her, hollow and distorted. The whispers surged in response, rising to a crescendo. Then, suddenly, they stopped. The silence was so abrupt, so absolute, that it felt deafening. Elise turned slowly, her breath caught in her throat. At the centre of the living room, the fog had begun to seep through the floorboards. It gathered in a swirling column, twisting and writhing like smoke caught in an updraft. Within the fog, a faint light glimmered, soft and hypnotic. Elise backed away, her spine pressing against the door as the fog coalesced into a form, vaguely human but indistinct, its edges constantly shifting and breaking apart. "Elise," the figure said, its voice layered, as though multiple people were speaking in unison. The sound resonated deep in her chest, both soothing and terrifying. "Who? What are you?" she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. The figure tilted its head, a gesture almost curious. "You don't belong here." The words hit her like a physical blow. "I don't understand," she said, shaking her head. "What do you mean? This is my home." The figure stepped closer, the glow intensifying. Elise felt its presence more than she saw it, a heavy, suffocating force that made her legs weak. "This is not your home," it said. "Not anymore." Tears welled in Elise's eyes. "Then where am I?" The figure extended a hand, or something like a hand, toward her. "You wandered too far. The fog does not forgive those who stray." The fog outside the house pulsed in time with the figure's words, as if echoing its meaning. Elise's mind raced. She thought of the moment she had first realized she was lost, the way the path had seemed unfamiliar, twisted. It was as though the fog itself had guided her somewhere else, somewhere she wasn't meant to be. "What do you want from me?" Elise asked, her voice cracking. The figure's glow dimmed slightly, as though it were considering her question. "You disturbed the balance," it said. "Now you must choose." "Choose what? To stay or to leave?" Elise frowned, her confusion mounting. "If I leave, I'll go back to Briarwood, back to my real home?" The figure's form flickered and the whispers returned, soft and distant. "There is no going back. You may leave this place, but you will never return to what you knew." "And if I stay?" The figure was silent for a moment, then spoke with a finality that chilled her to the bone. "If you stay, you will become one with the fog." The room seemed to darken further, the fog pressing in from all sides. Elise's mind reeled. Both choices were terrible. To leave meant abandoning everything she had ever known, stepping into an unknown world with no way back. To stay meant losing herself entirely, becoming part of this strange, otherworldly force that had ensnared her. She looked at the figure, her voice trembling. "Why me? Why did this happen to me?" The figure did not answer. Instead, it extended its hand further, waiting. Elise closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face as she tried to summon the courage to make a decision. Her thoughts raced to her memories of Briarwood, of her cozy home, of the life she had built. If she stayed, those memories would mean nothing. But if she left, she would carry them with her, even if she could never live them again. Finally, she opened her eyes and stepped forward. The figure loomed over her, its form pulsing with light. "I'll leave," she said, her voice barely audible. The figure nodded, its edges blurring as the fog around it thickened. "Then step into the mist." Elise turned to the front door. The fog outside had parted slightly, revealing a path that stretched endlessly into the grey. She reached for the knob, and this time it turned easily. As she stepped outside, the fog closed in behind her, swallowing the house and everything within it. She walked forward, the whispers fading with each step. The path stretched endlessly before her, but she felt a strange calm wash over her. The choice was made. Her old life was gone, but she was still herself, still Elise. And as she walked into the unknown, the fog carried her forward, its mysteries waiting to be uncovered. Elise walked through the fog, each step slow and deliberate, as if the mist were pulling at her legs, urging her to stay. The whispers had faded into the background now, like faint echoes of a memory she couldn't quite grasp. The only sound was the rhythmic crunch of her boots against the gravelly path beneath her feet. The oppressive grey began to thin, revealing faint shapes in the distance, trees, streetlights, and rooftops. Her heart thudded in her chest as she pressed forward, the fog slowly unravelling like a curtain being drawn back. The air grew lighter, less stifling, and the faint outline of a town began to emerge. But it wasn't Briarwood. The buildings were unfamiliar, the streets paved differently, and the air carried a strange scent, like freshly cut grass and rain-soaked asphalt, though it hadn't rained. As the fog completely dissolved, Elise found herself standing at the edge of a small, bustling town square. People moved about, chatting, laughing, and carrying on as though nothing was amiss. The scene was surreal, almost too perfect, like a postcard come to life. The architecture was different from Briarwood's quaint charm. The buildings were taller, more modern, with sleek lines and bright, colourful signs that advertised businesses she'd never heard of. She stood frozen, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. Where was she? How had she gotten here? The last thing she remembered was stepping through the door of her house into the endless fog. Had the figure lied? Had it truly let her leave, or was this another trick? "Elise," a voice said softly behind her. She spun around, but there was no one there. The street behind her was empty, the fog gone without a trace. Her pulse quickened as she turned back to the square. A woman walking by gave her a friendly smile, oblivious to Elise's confusion. "Excuse me," Elise called, her voice shaking as she stepped forward. "Where am I?" The woman stopped, her brow furrowing slightly in concern. "You're in Havenbrook," she said, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Are you all right? You look a little lost." "Havenbrook," Elise repeated, the name foreign on her tongue. I don't know this place." The woman's concern deepened. "Do you need help? Should I call someone?" Elise shook her head quickly. No, I'm fine. Thank you." She forced a small smile, though her heart was racing. The woman hesitated, then nodded and walked away, casting one last glance over her shoulder. Elise's eyes darted around the square, taking in the details. A bakery with large glass windows displayed rows of pastries she didn't recognize. A man sat on a bench reading a newspaper, the headline written in a language she couldn't quite place. A bus rumbled past, its destination scrolling across an LED sign, Midtown Terminal. The whispers were gone now, replaced by the lively hum of a town that seemed entirely unaware of her presence or her displacement. She clenched her fists, trying to steady her breathing. If this wasn't Briarwood, then where was it? Another town, another world, or had she been pulled into some other version of reality entirely? She wandered through the streets, her legs carrying her aimlessly. Every face she saw was unfamiliar, every street a mystery, yet the town felt strangely welcoming, as though it had been waiting for her. The fog was gone, but its effects lingered, wrapping her mind in a haze of questions she couldn't answer. As the day wore on, Elise realized she couldn't keep wandering forever. She needed to figure out what to do next. At the edge of the square, she spotted a small cafe with outdoor seating. She hesitated, then walked over and sat at one of the empty tables. A waitress appeared moments later, smiling brightly. "What can I get for you?" the waitress asked, her tone cheerful. Elise froze. She didn't recognize anything on the menu. The language was similar to English, but the words were just slightly off, letters rearranged, meanings skewed. She pointed to a random item, hoping it was something simple. "Great choice!" the waitress said, jotting it down before disappearing inside. As Elise sat there, staring at the unfamiliar streets and the foreign skyline, she realized she had two choices. She could fight this new reality, clinging to the life she'd lost, or she could accept it, adapt, and start over. The figure in the fog had been right. There was no going back. Briarwood, her home, her old life, it was gone. The waitress returned with a steaming cup of something that smelled faintly like coffee but tasted sweet and herbal. Elise sipped it slowly, letting its warmth settle her nerves. Maybe this was her second chance, a way to leave behind the monotony of her old life, the regrets she carried. Maybe this strange, perfect town was her new beginning. She thought of the whispers, the fog, and the figure that had guided her here. Whatever it had been, guardian, warden, or something else entirely, it had given her a choice. And now she had to live with it. As the sun set over Havenbrook, Elise stood from her table, her resolve hardening. She didn't know how she had come to be here, but she was here now. Whatever mysteries the fog held, whatever truths it had hidden from her, she would leave them behind. This was her life now, and she would make the most of it. Elise walked down the bustling street, her steps steady and determined. The whispers had faded, but their message lingered in her mind. You don't belong here. Maybe not, but she would make herself belong.